I thank the Speaker for his speech, and I'd like to invite the second Speaker, Laura, to continue her speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've seen that cities like Hanoi and Vietnam have massive economic expansion and improvement in recent years. The reason for that is not because they decided to establish a separate city somewhere and start from scratch. The reason why that economic development has been so successful is because we've seen urban sprawl around the fringes of cities. We've seen that by expanding those boundaries, we've created more opportunities for the labour market to increase. They've created more opportunities for poor people to get better jobs and better skills. On this side of the House, we absolutely stand for that urban sprawl. We do not think it is viable to just create new cities and expect the development will happen. We do not think it is viable for cities to continue building up. Richard gave you a lot of analysis at first about why building up is not viable for the kind of scope that we need to see, that often there are political forces that stop that from happening. That even if that's not the case, that when you have huge numbers of people living in a tiny pocket of space, that the pressure that causes on infrastructure and water and other kinds of resources is absolutely unsustainable. So if the opposition in today's debate really standard for sustainable cities and sustainable ways of living, they would not propose the counter model that they gave us. 3 questions. What will this model do for things like common heritage? What will it do for environmental damage? And what will it do for social equality? Let's take a look at this first question. What we heard from Beck was a lot of analysis about why the Amazon has been built over and why that's particularly harmful. 2 responses. 1, most of the development that has happened in South America and in Brazil has not actually in fact happened over the Amazon. We think most of that has been productive has been around the fringes of cities. We think that under our model that there is a market incentive to develop where it will be profitable. And we think that that incentive is not to go over the Amazon. We think it is to go as close to those cities as possible. So we think that that actually they've been playing up that harm, and we don't think it's as big as they want to make it out. But we also think that we still stand for environmental protection. What Richard explained to you is the kind of greenbelt laws that we're talking about don't affect heritage sites and national parks and places like the Amazon. We think that we are still happy to protect the Amazon under our model. The kinds of places that we are talking about are strips of land that are being used for farming, or strips of land that surround high-density cities that people don't want their views disturbed. So we don't think that's actually an issue in this debate. Now what we heard from Beck next is this idea that developers are going to drive up the prices of the houses they're building around the fringes. But we dispute that as well. Because Richard made clear at first, when you are deciding to develop somewhere, you need to look at the market forces in that area. We think that if the market is that poor people want to move to the city, we think there is an absolute financial incentive to build and to develop affordable housing. So we think that as a result of that, our model has far more capacity to create affordable housing for poor people. We hope that no, this would be better regulated by the government. We think that what happens when it's regulated by the government is it necessarily favours people with more political power in those cities. We told you at Richard that the people with more political power are wealthy people who are already living in those cities who have an interest in not expanding that to poor people. So we think the biggest harm is absolutely under the negative model. And then we heard lastly this idea that the government needs to control sustainability, like we saw in India. But we think that there is nothing about the kind of land use that we are proposing which is innately harmful. We think that poor people need to live somewhere. Even under the affirmative model, if you're going to be building new cities, you are still going to be causing some kind of building over on the land. We think that under our model, we're just doing that in a more efficient way. But more importantly, we think it is absolutely not the urban sprawl which causes the harm. We think the harm to the environment and the harm to common heritage comes from things like resource extraction. And resource extraction is not an issue in Adelaide. It's not something that is affected by our model. So we think we absolutely have adequate environmental protections in place. We think the difference between our model and the opposition's is we find a way to balance that with development and letting poor people live in places where they can have good jobs and good opportunities. That's something that will never happen under the opposition's model. Secondly, let's look at this question about environmental damage. And what we heard from Beck was that this will have serious consequences for trees, animals, and water tables. 1, those protections are already in place. But 2, even if we were to accept that there would be some kind of harm to these resources, we think there comes a point where you have to make a trade-off. We think that the trade-off is far better to be giving it to housing for poor people where they can have better economic development from that process than saving like we are willing to sacrifice some trees for that. We think it is something that is necessary for the development of that country. It's something that we are happy to stand for. And then we have this question about like whether or not rich people are in different housing markets. We think it is simplistic for them to say like rich people and poor people do not compete for housing. Like in this debate, they are competing for land, and we think like that land can be used either by rich or by poor people. So we think that we actually have much better competition under our side of the house. Lastly, this idea of social equality. We heard from Beck that when you restrict land, it creates innovation and makes better cities to live in. Rubbish, ladies and gentlemen. The kinds of places that have high density, building up housing, and like that's where you see the most problems in those kinds of cities, on their infrastructure, on their water, on other kinds of resources that get really overused. We think the governments have no incentive to actually innovate in those kind of areas. And like Richard told you about how ghettos develop, and in fact building up leads to huge amounts of social problems and infrastructure problems. We've heard no analysis from Sydney about why that innovation actually occurs. We haven't had enough analysis from them. We don't buy it. Onto my own substantive material. What I'm going to talk about today is why getting rid of these greenbelt rules will be fundamentally good for economic development and also for labour. And so I think that what we see under the status quo is that the poorest people are priced out of the market for living in cities. We think that happens because there is a lack of affordable housing. We think as a result of that, it means that there are large segments of poor people who are living in rural areas and isolated areas where they don't have access to good jobs, so they don't have access to a range of opportunities like they would have in the cities. I think like people are not making necessarily a choice to live in rural areas. We think it is something that is forced upon them as a result of structural inequality. Our model changes that. Let's take a look at why. I think firstly in terms of economic development, we think that under our model, the market can be used to determine how developments can occur most efficiently. We think like development often happens through an expansion of cities. I think it happens when you move from unproductive subsistence farming into manufacturing. I think that manufacturing and other kinds of industries can necessarily only happen within cities, where you have things like electricity and running water and transport systems that allow people to get to those kinds of jobs. Our model increases the number of people who will be able to move to those cities, but more importantly, developers have more freedom to be able to respond to that pressure. They have more freedom to be able to build that housing where it needs to be most. And so we think that the outcome of that is that you get a much larger labour market. You get more workers, you have more of a capacity for innovation and development because you have more resources in that city working more productively, but that work can be used well. Like we think if you are going to get innovation, you get it by increasing the number of people who are going to be working in the city, and we think that that happens under our model, not under the opposition's. But then in terms of workforce benefits, we think that our model also provides more benefit to labour relative to capital. I think like what we see in rural employment under the status quo is that like in a lot of places you will have one employer who can excessively control things like prices and wages and conditions. Like the hypothetical here is one cotton mill who buys the cotton from a range of cotton farmers. It means like when you only have that one mill, they have a huge capacity to control what that price is and how it will be sold and what happens with those farmers. So I feel like that's a fundamental imbalance that harms those cotton farmers. So I think like our model corrects this. Firstly, because more people can move to the city where better conditions are available as a result of there being more competition. But secondly, we think that just having the choice to be able to move to cities forces rural employers to create better conditions, to create better incentives to stay because they know that their labour force can leave. We think that is fundamentally good for development. We think it is good for innovation, and our model absolutely has the best outcomes for poor people in developing nations. Because we think they are the absolute stakeholder in this debate, and because we protect them best, I am very proud to propose.